On sesiún sin, and there are sesiún on a species. We have two speakers today. We have Niall Murray and Nell Buttimer, and I'm going to introduce each of them separately, if that's okay with you. So Niall will speak first for about 40 minutes, and then Nell will come and speak to us, and then we'll have an opportunity for a co-row, for a conversation, and for some questions and answers, I hope. I want to introduce Niall. Niall has recently begun work towards a PhD at the School of History in UCC, which follows his achievement of an MA in History, also from UCC, in 2017. His MA on the topic of the evolution of political and social life in this parish of Kilmurry between 1914 and 1918. His current research for his PhD focuses on the revolutionary period in the Macroom district, including the work of Terence MacSwiney as TD for the Mid-Cork constituency in the first Dáil. Not unlike MacSwiney, Niall is a native of Cork City whose roots are firmly planted in this area. He's one of a team of volunteers working extremely efficiently and effectively to promote the Independence Museum here in Kilmurry since it opened in 2016. Niall is a former education correspondent with the Irish Examiner newspaper, where he also contributed many historically informed features on the period of the Irish Revolution. So it gives me great pleasure, and I ask you to put your hands together to welcome Niall to the podium.
Very much, thank you, John. I feel a bit in a hard place now after listening to those fine speakers earlier. Never mind the speakers we had this morning, who I was going to praise anyway, but I won't go on. Just the title of my paper today is Terence MacSwiney, Student, Teacher and Propagandist. So I may veer back and forth a little chronologically and between these different aspects of Terence MacSwiney's life. And when I speak about him as a student and as a teacher, I mean not just in the formal education of school or college or university, but in how he learned from and taught others throughout his own life, short and all as it was, and how that had an influence on his later role as a Republican philosopher and as a propagandist. Hope someone manages to make sense, but there's a lot of evolving thoughts going on there, but you can pin me down in some aspects later afterwards if you like. So, what were Terence MacSwiney's own views on education? In 1910, he declared himself as always being in touch with education. This is when he was applying for a teaching job. 50 years after his death in 1970, his widow Muriel said that fine education was among the many services Terence wanted for Ireland. Once the tyranny of the Sassenach was gone, the others were good wages, proper health services, no unemployment, and comfortable and social housing. So obviously that's all been achieved in the meantime. I'm sure any revolutionary figure might have reflected similarly, looking back at such a distance and in the context of a much different Ireland then. Muriel assured the Department of Defence civil servants administering her military service widows' pension that none knew better than Terry did what poverty and bad conditions were. This appears to have been in reference to his childhood, which, although maybe not the most impoverished in Cork City, was hardly secure or ever the height of comfort. We heard some of that about that this morning in terms of Mary and Abby's childhood and their upbringing. But regardless of conditions, it was a home of educators, as we know from this morning and from Cathal's discussion last night. He was the son of teachers and a brother of at least, I know 4 sisters who would become or were already teachers, as he was himself attending school. Born in Cork City in 1879, his father John, as many of you will know, came from very near here in Crookstown. He went on through a rather circuitous route to live back in Cork City via Italy, where he tried to fight in the Papal Army in the late 1860s, and then in London, where he met and married Mary Wilkinson, also a teacher. Like many lower middle class boys of his time, Terence MacSwiney attended the North Monastery, a Christian Brothers school on the hills above the north side of Cork City, close to Shandon and the one-time family home at Fair Hill. I'm probably have the wrong photo, identified the wrong student, all right? Yeah. Yes. That's what happens when you try and move the circles on the photographs. Anyway, thank you, Carl, for pointing that out. It's,
yeah.
And Just seeing who was paying attention, thank you. You're still awake. Not me, back in the class. So his long-time friend and his Northmont classmate, P.S. O'Hagerty, wrote in 1922 that in school, Terence became more and more a dreamer and a planner. He also described how during school holidays, unlike most kids then, or I suspect today, he worked steadily from the beginning of the holiday until he had all the work set for the holidays finished, and then enjoyed an uninterrupted spell of real holidays. But was MacSwiney as happy and pleasant in secondary school as O'Hagerty describes, when he said that MacSwiney regretted leaving to work as an office clerk aged 15? Maybe not so much. He later wrote himself that he was probably happiest at school in the preparatory year before starting secondary, and whether he was instilled hugely with a love of learning and literature at that stage is also uncertain. O'Hagerty wrote, "Terry was one of the unfinished products of the intermediate, the exam beyond which most boys in secondary school, unless their families had the ambition and the means to send them on to university. Irish was taught," O'Hagerty wrote, "for love of itself as well as for the sake of the marks it brought in the examination. So too with Irish history." Despite his later writing and their emphasis on philosophical thought, the one subject in which he did not gain an honour in the intermediate board exams was philosophy. He did, however, excel at Latin, English, commercial English, Gaeilge, French and French business and arithmetic. O'Hagerty attributes the deep nationalism in Terry and others to the teaching of the Christian Brothers, saying that they owed their first conscious impulse towards an aggressive nationalism from the education given them at the Christian Brothers. I tend to agree more, however, with John Borganovo, who's one of my PhD supervisors at UCC. I'd have to agree with him, of course. His view is that it was not so much what was being taught or by whom, but rather who was being taught. At Christian Brothers School is like the North Monastery. The fact that so many of the city's revolutionary figures were ex-pupils of the Mon had as much to do with their social and family backgrounds, maybe. Boys and adolescents from homes where there was ambition enough to see them progress to secondary school, and with hopes that they could make their way in the civil service. This was the focus, rather than a university education, which would be a topic which would be the subject of strong political and religious debate in the first decade of the last century. The drapers and grocers of Macroom, an example of a large market town, produced a significant group of revolutionary leaders, but this town had no Christian Brother education on offer to its young men of MacSwiney's generation. A story is told by another of MacSwiney's biographers, Dermot O'Brien, of an incident in which Terry intervened in a row among a group of students at school over whether they should play Gaelic football or rugby. After Terry mediated, Terry was how he was known, I think, to most of his friends growing up, and after, he decided to use their pooled money to buy a ball for each code. But he soon put that diplomacy aside when the rugby playing crew took issue with the others and disposed of the Gaelic football ball in a nearby bog. Terry MacSwiney grabbed the rugby ball and it ended up in the very same place. Now it might well have, I'm not sure it was necessarily the code, but rather the inequality that he saw, or the one-upmanship that he was seeing. I mentioned this in the context of a perception of the Irish Ireland figures all coming from a background where foreign or garrison games were taboo all their lives. Of course, some of you may know one of the GAA's founders, Michael Cusack, I think, was a keen and very skilled cricketer. Several years after their school days were over, P.S. O'Hagerty, who I mentioned, and his brother Sean, who was buried in St.Mary's graveyard here in Kilmurry, both fierce IRB and Fenian men, they both represented their employer Cork Post Office. Here they are in the post office team that defeated UCC, Queen's College, by 3-0 to win the Cork Senior Cup, March 1902. You mightn't be able to tell from the photograph, but that's an oval ball in the foreground. So the two O'Hagertys, Sean O'Hagerty would later succeed MacSwiney as commander of the Cork No. 1 IRA Brigade. They both played rugby for the post office, but fear not, they also, in 1905, at least there's another photograph, played hurling. Sean himself was to be hurled out of the post office for his nationalist activities in 1914, but that's another story. At school, Terence MacSwiney got honours in Celtic, as it was described, the Irish language, in the intermediate board exams, and in English, where essay writing and Irish history were part of the curriculum. In his own words, "I passed successfully through the preparatory, junior and middle grades of the intermediate examinations, being awarded an exhibition of £20 for 3 years in succession, essentially a scholarship to the best students. They kind of rush straight home to get their summer homework done first day of holidays. He was 15 when he left school to take up work at one of the city's biggest manufacturing firms, Dwyer and Company, in July 1894. Became an accountant there after 6 years, aged 21. He was entrusted with the charge of one of the firm's busy accounting ledgers, and after 15 years' service, I quote one of his employers, he was perfectly conversant with our business methods and the principles of bookkeeping, single and double entry. Exciting stuff, maybe not, but it was the sign of a capable mind at a time when large firms required high standards in the days long before calculators or spreadsheets and accounting software. And again, it suggests a man who was an avid learner. Even if the work didn't enthuse him, he was well capable of picking up these skills and adopting them in his 16 plus year service at Dwyer's. He was also required to engage in extensive correspondence with Dwyer's business customers and their suppliers. The kind of correspondence learned by MacSwiney in that job would benefit later his work as a full-time organiser for the Irish Volunteers, a Gaelic League executive member, a chapter Dáil here in the Mid-Cork district in the first Dáil Éireann from January 1919, and after the death of his old friend Tomás McCurtain at the hands of the Cork City Police, as an IRA brigade commander and Lord Maire of his native city. He wasn't alone, of course. All of their experiences in various Irish Ireland organisations equipped dozens of women and men with the skills that facilitated the creation of a counter-state run by Dáil Éireann following the 1918 general election. In their recent biographical treatment of Michael Collins, Anne Dolan and Will Murphy attribute the big fella's tremendous output of correspondence, directives, circulars and intelligence direction to his experience gained while, as we heard earlier, he was living in London, and he was active in the GAA and Gaelic League circles there before coming back to Ireland ahead of the 1916 Rising. He also happened to be very close there with Terence MacSwiney's old classmate, P.S.R. Hagerty from the North Mon. Returning to the Irish language for a little, it's hard to tell exactly MacSwiney's acumen or his abilities, even if he was clearly a believer from his writing in the use of Irish for anybody involved in any form of nationalist organisation, of which we might hear a little later from Nell Buttimer. In 1914, he would write that, I quote, "There is no excuse for anyone calling himself or herself Irish, not being a member of some one of these branches," he was talking about of the Gaelic League in Cork, "and settling down to study the tongue of Ireland. Volunteers, particularly, who profess themselves ready to fight for the defence of their Ireland, should have love for their country's language." That's in his Fianna Fáil newspaper in November 1914, of which I'll speak a little later. But note, it was not so much a fluency or even a high standard of Irish, but simply a love for their country's language that was required of any true nationalists, such as those in the Irish Volunteers. Sounds a little like what Anne was mentioning earlier of the expectation in regards Irish taught at Scolita. You didn't have to be a master of the language, but just to have a love of it. In June 1915, I probably misidentified again, but I think this may be Terence MacSwiney in this photograph in Ballingeary in 1912. In 1915, he had again, in his own words, a good knowledge of the language, both spoken and written, when he notified his employer at the County Cork Technical Instruction Committee of his interest in taking up a summer course at Coláiste na Muin in Ballingeary. This was the teacher training college set up a decade earlier by his fellow Gaelic League activists in Cork, Liam de Rocha and others, who were his fellow leading Sinn Féiners in the following decade in Cork City particularly. He wanted at that point qualification to teach Irish as a commercial subject, but of course he had spent plenty of time at the Irish College in Ballingeary in the preceding years and would do so again in the years that followed. The summer of 1915 saw MacSwiney's life take a different turn as he resigned that teaching job for a new role as County Cork organiser for the Irish Volunteers. According to Liam de Rocha, who would otherwise have lost his teaching job with the County Instructional Committee, there was an issue of principle in Terence's decision. De Rocha himself had been treated unjustly, and Terence believed he should forego his own job for someone in the role longer than himself. Of course, a further turn would be taken in his life later in 1915, when a new adherent to the Irish Ireland movement began moving in the same circles. Muriel MacSwiney described in 1974 how she was, I quote, "very active in the Irish movement of liberation since the autumn of 1915, big open-air meeting in honour of the Manchester martyrs. I also learned our own beautiful Gaeilge and never spoke English when possible not to. It might be no coincidence that Terence MacSwiney appears to have had a revived interest in improving his own Irish when he first became acquainted with the younger Muriel Murphy, ultimately falling in love and marrying her 2 years later. There's also further evidence of MacSwiney being an advocate and participant in lifelong learning, now the subject of an annual festival in the city, whose corporation he once chaired. Or to borrow from the name of another event run by Cork City Libraries, he was a constant reader. One of his biographers, Maureen Chavas, pinpoints the start of his interest in learning and culture to a lecture he attended of visiting Professor Savage Armstrong on Shakespeare's Macbeth. This was a lecture to the Cork Catholic Young Men's Society, dated in this Cork Examiner report to December 1899. MacSwiney was 20 and just beginning his accounting role in Dwyer's. Macbeth was one of several of the Bard's works which MacSwiney and friends enthused about from regular attendance at Cork Opera House once they were earning a wage as young adults from around the late 1890s. But he was also reading Dickens, who we heard mentioned earlier, and Thackeray, with the likes of Wolfe Tone and John Mitchell, the young Irelander prison diarist, balancing his literary diet. Geraldine Sullivan, later Geraldine Neeson, although she was probably referring to his later life, described MacSwiney as an omnivorous reader, a rather apt phrase for someone whose library clearly contained a vast array of subjects and perhaps viewpoints. She did note, however, that he consumed a daily portion, as we heard discussed by Cathal last night, from the works of Thomas à Kempis, perhaps reflecting the very spiritual side of the man also, which was largely handed down through his mother. By 1914, he had amassed a significant personal library, then sold it off to fund his short-lived propagandist Fianna Fáil newspaper. It's not so clear when he began collecting books, or to what degree it was dominated or otherwise by works of Irish nationalism, or the literature that had been emerging from the 1890s cultural revival around Irish myths and legends. But we do know that such works featured in his reading, and that they evidently influenced his own literary output. He was also, however, reading the plays of Ibsen and other international writers, which likely influenced his dramatic output of the years circa 1910 to 15, which included The Revolutionists, published in 1914, but only first staged after his death at the Abbey in early 1921. We know that his library featured, among many hundreds, maybe more, myths and legends of the Celtic race by Rolleston, and Standish O'Grady's History of Ireland. We have Catherine Brugha's essay on the Revolutionists to thank for that knowledge, and this copy of Bards of the Gael and Gaul, a 1907 edition of George Segerson's 1891 collection of The Poetic Literature of Aidan. MacSwiney was behind the decision of the Cork Celtic Literary Society in 1904 to buy 1,000 copies for resale of The Resurrection of Hungary, the new book by a chap called Arthur Griffith. Did this show foresight or a value placed on the future influence of Griffith's Sinn Féin movement, even though he was in this period himself, MacSwiney, reluctant to support it? Or was it the more astute business acumen of an experienced accountant? We can see the potential fundraising potential from book sales during an upcoming lecture of Jeremiah Donovan Rossa to this society. Maybe a little of both, or maybe he was simply anxious to spread as much as possible the word of any separatist in printed form, signs again maybe of the emerging propagandist. So I mentioned the Cork Celtic Literary Society. Who were they? Terence MacSwiney was a founder member of the organisation in 1901. It was effectively a branch in Cork of the Cumann and Gael organisation, established by Maud Gonne, Old Fenian, John O'Leary and others. Maud Gonne spoke at a meeting in Cork in March 1902, when Terence MacSwiney insisted on dragging older sister Annie from their home in Fairhill across town in the pouring rain to City Hall to hear her speak. Cumann and Gael was later branded as a mix of Fenianism and Gaelicism, and was also largely a precursor to Sinn Féin, Arthur Griffith being a lead figure in both. Cultural nationalism was alive and well by this early decade of the last century in County Cork, and not just in the city. Maud Gonne lectured in the same trip to Cork in Skibbereen, and Conor Gaeilge had branches in district committees in most parts of the county, including a Macroom district with branches in Inchigeela, Kilmurry, Canavy, Tomes and Berrings. But of the Celtic Literary Society, its main aim was to strive for the establishment of an Irish Republic, and its methods, as well as adopting the principles of Wolfe Tone's United Irishmen, included working for the restoration of the national language and the study and teaching of Irish history. It was made up mostly of younger men breaking away from the local Young Ireland Society, which was instrumental in having Cork's National Monument erected on the Grand Parade. But some of the older generation also joined up, bringing MacSwiney into the same circles as some of those who had participated in political and other revolutions of the past, including Patrick Corcoran, a printer in his late 40s and briefly around 1906 a Labour representative on Cork Corporation. He had been jailed in 1888 during the Land War and the National League's plan of campaign. His crime? Working for the Cork Examiner. No comment as a former employee. To be more precise, he had been foreman printer when the paper published reports of National League meetings banned by the British administration in Ireland, using the same law that permitted non-jury courts, which would be used over 30 years later against MacSwiney and his contemporaries. The Crown prosecuted Corcoran, despite the protests of editor George Crosby that he was the publisher and should be the man in the dock. Corcoran, however, neither cried foul against his employer or put up a defence. As Republicans adopted from 1917 through to 1921, he refused to recognise an English court, restricting his words to the following: "I have only to say that I am now, what I have been all my lifetime, an Irish nationalist." Perhaps reminiscent of the defiance shown by the first citizen of Cork at a military court in August 1920. Corcoran was sent to Cork jail for 2 months. His imprisonment and release doing wonders in the press for the National League's cause, and his reputation on the back of it still spoken about decades later when MacSwiney and the new generation of revolutionaries shared committee rooms with older members of Cork's nationalist community. Links like these would prove invaluable when it came to political and military printing and propaganda needs of Sinn Féin and the IRA in the years either side of the Easter Rising. That's another day's discussion. One of the main drivers in the Celtic Literary Society was MacSwiney's friend Liam de Rochta. Between them, they regularly alternated in key officer roles in the organisation, although they didn't always see eye to eye on positions of around publicity or political direction. In 1904, Terence was also central in organising a lecture by visiting Fenian legend Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, whose major influence on MacSwiney was discussed at length here by Gabriel Doherty last year. In 1905, at a meeting which MacSwiney chaired as the Society chairman, activities of the previous 6 months were outlined, including, as well as debates, lectures and other events, and our investigation of the teaching of Irish history in the national schools, and the Society hoped, to quote its secretary's report, to make the subject loom larger in the future in the school programme than is at present the case. Again, rather pertinent to today's discussions, or today's education discussion debates. Women's nationalist and feminist organisation Iníní na hÉireann had also worked alongside the Celtic Literary Society in such activities. Key revolutionary figures like Nora O'Brien, a close friend of Mary MacSwiney, were already to the fore. She was also at one point a member of the Celtic Literary Society for a period. Iníní na hÉireann's local branch president, Margaret Goulding, attended a reading of the Society's Era Oak manual, accompanied by one of the organisation's Belfast members, Alice Milligan. Did Terence learn something from this established author about adapting Irish legends and myths for the modern stage? Milligan had already written The Last Feast of the Fianna and The Daughter of Donagh, which was staged in the Abbey Theatre. The 1900 performance of The Last Feast of the Fianna incidentally featured Maud Gunn. Or did Alice Milligan impart something that later struck a chord about publishing a newspaper? Her Shan Van Vogt, founded and co-edited with Ethna Carberry, was printed from 1896 to 1899, which was a full 15 years before MacSwiney produced Fianna Fáil in the first weeks of the First World War. Although he had prior to that written his Principles of Freedom essays for the IRB's Saoirse na hÉireann, or Irish Freedom newspaper, in 1911. In 1905, at a meeting attended by Milligan during her Cork visit, MacSwiney led opposition to the Celtic Literary Society publishing a weekly nationalist paper, maybe conscious either of a saturated market or believing the time not right, in a city that had jubilantly welcomed King Edward and his royal entourage not 2 years earlier. Liam de Rochta, his future fellow member of the First Dáil in 1919, recorded that MacSwiney felt the time was not right for the Society to push its principles on the broader public. He was, in de Rochta's view at least, more keen on writing and studying. This was coming into early 1906. MacSwiney was then working toward his own degree from the Royal University, National University in Ireland in Cork at this stage. His ultimate aim, and one much more succinct than others in the Celtic Literary Society, was for the establishment of an Irish Republic, not the dual monarchy kind of model being pursued by the Sinn Féin movement, which de Rochta was keen to pursue. It was in 1907 when MacSwiney did get his university degree, seeing himself through college while all the time working at Dwyer's as an accountant. His degree was in mental and moral science. I have to confess I don't know much of the course content there, but again, the 30-year-old graduate suggested to a prospective employer 3 years later that it would prove of great service to him as a teacher as it embraces psychology. Curious, that was the only subject in which he didn't excel up in the North Mon. I have always been in touch with educational matters, he wrote in the same letter of application for a teaching job in 1910 with the Cork Municipal School of Commerce. A hint at the real level of his passion, or maybe just a vague enthusiasm, I'm not sure, for education is in the fact that the words "in touch with," I've reproduced it here, "in touch with" replaced the crossed out "interested in," which he had first written of his relationship with educational matters. I might be just taking reading too much into his letter writing skills. He beat off a large field of competitors, largely because for the teaching job, largely because of his high level and standard of education, to securing the post as teacher of business methods. His 2 terms in that role, teaching commercial practice and correspondence, were described by Principal Daniel Joseph Coakley as a decided success. He demonstrated his capacity for organising and efficiently conducting his classes, and crucially for some of his later ventures, a clear insight into the practical requirements of the students. This and other commendations assured him unanimous selection by the County Cork Joint Technical Instruction Committee, a precursor of today's Cork Education and Training Board and the VEC that preceded it, for a post 18 months later as a county commercial instructor. Here he is in the staff room photograph. I'm not sure many of them look too happy to be in the photograph, but I'm sure things are much different in today's staff rooms. Is that right? From January 1912, Terence MacSwiney travelled to towns around the county, organising and teaching classes, much as he would do for parts of 1915 and 16 as an organiser of the Irish Volunteers, travelling and overnighting using the roads and rail network, often covering long distances by bicycle. That organising work for the volunteers was, I argued in my own 2016 thesis, which John alluded to, MacSwiney's work there was crucial to the vitality of the volunteer organisation before Easter 1916, and I think also more crucially helps ensure sustainability in the months and the year or two after 1916. While teaching for the County Technical Instruction Committee, he visited towns largely in North Cork, including Mitchelstown, Riverstown, Doneraile, Kanturk, Charleville and Mallow. But rather than the content and the quality of his teaching, I find it interesting to note what he learned himself about the lives of those from the social class he was instructing. He was now in his early 30s, and most students would have been young men in their late teens and early 20s, pursuing careers like he had entered into at age 15 in Dwyer's. Drapers and grocers' assistants, clerks in offices, and large town stores who needed their staff trained in the business skills being taught by MacSwiney. The kind of occupations that numerous historians have pointed to as the leaders and officers at local levels of the IRA, although this is a trend I'm keen to test a little further, looking at specifically at the Macroom district. His interactions with these young students gave MacSwiney, the teacher, distinct insights into the mindset, the family backgrounds, and no doubt the politics of a slightly younger generation than his. He learned to understand how attendance at classes might be influenced by various factors, those that would equally affect his organisation for the Irish Volunteers in the many rural districts he would visit outside of Cork City in 1915 and 16. Take one letter he wrote to J.M. Buckley, Secretary to the Technical Instruction Committee in 1913, explaining why a night class had been cancelled in, I think it was in Kanturk. Quote, he wrote, "In consequence of the fair, the shops are busy and the assistants can't get out in time to attend class." But he was keen himself to reorganise the time rather than simply cancel and lose out on the evident interest in the town, like one of his colleagues had suggested. Reading through his Irish Volunteer organising diary for the final months of 1915, one sees the experience of someone who clearly understood from his interaction with his students the importance of putting on meetings and training at time that worked for the target audience of recruitment drives. In the Kinsale district, for example, he was acutely aware of the impact that hunting and thrashing had on the time available to the young men he wanted into the volunteers. Many came from the labouring class whose time was rarely their own. Although we mostly think today of as the spring of 1918 as being the main period in which conscription of young Irishmen into military service was a real danger, a similar crisis was building in late 1915 in Ireland through to January 1916, when conscription was eventually introduced for the rest of the United Kingdom, but not in Ireland. A military intelligence officer described it in Cork as writing that the press has a great influence in the country districts, the views of the people being drawn from the local paper, the priest and the national schoolmaster. That being the case, however, MacSwiney was more in tune with the demographic that he was targeting. He took the advice of local elders around Cork, just like he had learned so much from in those he had learned so much from in the Celtic Literary Society. They told him that it would take a sudden crisis and danger, nothing less, to move local men into action. The trouble, as MacSwiney figured, though, was that the young men were not alive to the danger of conscription, as they never see the daily papers and know nothing of what happens, not in touch with news of the impending crisis. So he only knew that from the knowledge of the men he had been teaching in his classes, I believe. This left it to MacSwiney and others to impart the news and the consequences of conscription that was being considered far, far away in Westminster, our favourite place in the news these days. We don't have any scripts of what was being said at such recruiting meetings, but himself and others like Sean Nolan, Pat Higgins, Tomás McCurtain, Donal O'Callaghan, the latter to his predecessor and successor as Lord Maire. We don't know exactly what was said, but we know from police reports and others that their campaign was very successful. It was largely based on an anti-recruitment message, although even in late 1915 there was very little interest in the British Army in the rural districts around here. But the British Army was still holding recruiting meetings in these parts. One was held outside Mass in Clodoof on March 5th, 1916, just a few weeks before the Rising. MacSwiney and others, though, had already managed to enlist dozens of young locals into the Irish Volunteers. Around 30 men from Kilmurry parish marched with the volunteers in Cork City's St. Patrick's Day Parade. That's just less than a fortnight after the British Army tried recruiting people at Clodoof. I have a firm suspicion, knowing that the Kilmurry lads were only armed with pikes, that there's probably a few Kilmurry and Crookston men in this photograph here. That's taken on walking in from the Western Road towards the city. This is the kind of pattern replicated in parishes and towns around Cork in 1915 and 16. It mightn't be a coincidence that one of his fellow recruiters, Donal O'Callaghan, was another teacher with the Technical Instruction Committee around this period. In 1915, at the Manchester Martyrs commemoration in Cork, the same volunteers heard Sean McDermott, who would be at that stage planning the Rising secretly, speak in Cork. And those who came back on the train to Macroom would hear MacSwiney give an unscheduled speech where he said, "This is the anniversary of the Manchester Martyrs, but we come together tonight not in sorrow but in triumph. It is always a matter for rejoicing that men are ready to die for freedom." So rather than retell the story of the martyrs, he spoke of men being prepared to endure a like ordeal and bring a new glory on our honour and cause. The sacrifice of the Manchester Martyrs is one particularly for freedom by the rank and file. It's the kind of language that might seem extreme today, but remember that you were hearing the same kind of thing in British Army recruitment speeches. It was just a matter who you were propagandising for. And he also would have been aware of the close local connections in County Cork to the Manchester Martyrs, evidence of which you can see downstairs in the table made by William Philip Allen. All of this is more to do with the spoken word, but going back to his printed word and back in time again, the strong anti-recruitment sentiment against the British Army used by MacSwiney in 1915 and 16 was not something he spent a whole lot of time working on at that point, because he had done plenty on the topic a year before. I mentioned earlier his Fianna Fáil newspaper, but MacSwiney's first real foray into having his words in regular print came when his Principle of Freedom essays were first published from March 1911 to December 1912. Obviously they were later reproduced and with some small additions after his death. The first piece had been penned in December 1910 by MacSwiney, who had just a few months earlier begun his teaching job at the School of Commerce. They appeared between anti-English news from around the Empire, articles on dead Irish rebels and accounts of Fenian rebellions more recent, the likes of Tom Clark and his father-in-law John Daly of Limerick. It may have helped MacSwiney's case for publication of what were very philosophical and heavy writings that Irish Freedom was being edited around this time by a certain gentleman called P.S. O'Hegarty. While MacSwiney wrote in the manner which might have led him to being awarded a philosophy-based degree, the journal's audience might not have been suited to such material. Few of the readers' letters published were in praise of MacSwiney's words, well, there was very few on his column, but it was largely filled with more literary affairs and monthly reports of the growth of the Fianna Gael and Scouting movement. By the time 1914 came around, his library, now sold to fund the venture, MacSwiney, the experienced teacher, had a much greater knowledge of the minds of young men and politically interested citizens whose views needed some adjustment. The opening article of Fianna Fáil newspaper in September 1914 refers at least a handful of times to Ireland's ancient glory and its ancient and tyrannical enemies across the Irish Sea. His message was very clear. Cork's politics was dominated by conflict in the previous 5 years between William O'Brien's All for Ireland League and John Redmond's grassroots organisation, the United Irish League, but both had now found a common voice by advocating for young Irishmen to enlist in His Majesty's services and fight in Europe. As the Irish Volunteers in Cork, of which MacSwiney was a leading figure, had been decimated by the split following Redmond's call to support England's cause, the propagandist came to shine in MacSwiney. The most important thing he wrote in explaining why the first issue had a mere 4 pages was to have some paper in which to articulate the national feelings of Cork that can find no outlet in the local press, so utterly and inconceivably base has the daily press become that it is imperative to make every effort to counter and destroy its influence. Other than the Unionist Cork Constitution, the other 2 daily newspapers in the city were William O'Brien, who I mentioned, his daily Cork Free Press, and the Crosby's Redmondite Cork Examiner, neither of whose editorial stances would have weighed up well against MacSwiney and others. Essentially, subtitled as it was a journal for militant Ireland, even if it hardly circulated outside Cork, Fianna Fáil was an outlet for getting men into the stagnating Irish Volunteers and into Cumann na mBan, the more recently formed Women's Auxiliary Movement. Adopting the manner of militant language now so widespread across Europe, the second issue included a report of drilling by city volunteers at Inniscarra and a fledgling company in none other than Ballingeary. He wrote, "The fine physique and splendid stride of the men would do one's heart good to see. The shooting arouses the greatest interest and rivalry. Already some of the men are expert shots. Nothing like riling up a little rivalry, trying to egg prospective recruits into join the volunteers, or getting existing members to have a go at being the best shot in the land, or the county at least." He would regularly send similar reports about progress of his organisation work to the Irish Volunteer magazine in 1915 and 16. When the 3rd edition of Fianna Fáil appeared a week late, because he could get no Cork printer to put it out because of pressure from British censorship, even this was put to good propaganda use after he secured a Dublin printer for the job. "Even if late, we determined to get it done at any cost. Our arrival late served at least to let the enemy know, if delayed, we were not defeated." He went on, "We beg to reassure our friends we have come to stay." The reason he couldn't get his older friend Patrick Corcoran, incidentally, to print it was because Corcoran had begun publishing his own anti-recruitment and largely anti-William O'Brien paper, the Cork Celt. Both were suppressed by the British and ceased publication in November and December 1914. Whereas for MacSwiney, he'd found his writing groove since penning Principles of Freedom just 2 to 3 years earlier for Irish Freedom. He had, of course, also published his stage play The Revolutionist in 1914, having had several earlier works staged by the Cork Dramatic Society. Patrick Maugham's plot summary of The Revolutionist describes the hero as an idealised version of its author, outlining that after becoming engaged, the fictional Hugh O'Neill found a separatist paper and deliberately works himself to death trying to establish it. I also have little doubt, by the way, that Kilmurry's Hugh O'Neill Sinn Féin Club, so named in 1917, was a homage to MacSwiney's dramatic hero. To finish, in considering MacSwiney as an eternal student and always keen to develop his ability to have others adopt his political viewpoint, it also underlines what is evident in other aspects of his life and work from what I have studied of it. He was incredibly thorough and perhaps maybe to his detriment, I don't know, he was also a perfectionist. When questions arose in 1906 about the Celtic Literary Society adopting the Sinn Féin policies as a political organisation, MacSwiney insisted they were not ready, believing, wrote Liam de Rochta, that we need to educate and prepare ourselves if we are to be leaders of a national movement. Echoes are important maybe of Roy Keane's fail to prepare to fail. I'm not sure, maybe I read too much. MacSwiney also strongly opposed the society producing its own weekly nationalist paper, something he would, as I mentioned, eventually do himself. Was his selection of a philosophy-related degree anything to do with the fact that it was the only subject he didn't excel in at school? Maybe not. I don't know. His words of instruction to a newly founded Irish Volunteers Company here in Kilmurry in 1915 included messages of perseverance. Keep going until you get things right. And in the words of John T. Murphy from OrLissarda, his one-time university friend and his 1918 director of elections, he was a leader we could trust. He had weighed the consequences from A to Z. I'm no mathematical scientist, so forgive my probable misunderstanding of this, but I suspect it's no coincidence that Terence's grandson Cathal is Professor Emeritus at UCD in the discipline of decision analytics. Maybe there was a certain insecurity in MacSwiney's unwillingness to proceed with any plan unless the result would be the best possible. His teasing out of issues around attacking and burning RSC police barracks in the countryside around us in 1920 is evident in some of his notebooks in the archive. There's a sense sometimes too that as a child of teachers, and whose older sisters at home were also teachers, he may have felt constant pressure, perhaps only from within, to be and to do only his very best. We know that MacSwiney was similarly principled, Mary MacSwiney rather, was similarly principled, and she paid the price reputationally for her insistence on sticking to her principles, which would probably have been different had her gender been a different one as well. What I think does emerge more succinctly from the work I've touched on in preparing this paper is that, just then, as in other stages of his life, during his 5 years as a salaried teacher, in which he was involved in many other things, MacSwiney was also always learning. He was in training, ever the lifelong learner, developing his own skills as a revolutionary politician and as a propagandist.
No, thank you very much for a superb paper. It's clear that we have every bit as eminent scholar and historian as we have had journalist. So thank you so much, Niall, and you will have a lot of readers of this PhD when it emerges. Nell Buttimer also has very strong UCC links, and it gives me huge pleasure to welcome him as a colleague of mine indeed, from UCC, where he has lectured since 1982 in the Department of Modern Irish, Rhine and Nua Gaeilge. He received his undergraduate and postgraduate education at UCC, the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, and Harvard University, where he took his PhD, and also where he initiated the Harvard Celtic Colloquium in 1981, which flourishes to this day, initiated by Niall. Earlier, he attended none other than the Northmont CBS secondary school, just like so many others, MacSwiney, McCurtain, the O'Hegartys, and many others. Niall's varied research interests include the cataloguing of print and manuscript Irish language sources and the history of Irish as an academic discipline. He's also a champion of what we call interdisciplinarity, the bolting together and the cross-fertilisation, if you like, of distinct disciplines. And he has created extremely interesting and productive and indeed profitable linkages between Irish and law, Irish and business, Irish and commerce. He led for a long time UCC's flagship higher diploma and MA in Irish Heritage Management, which indeed he also established. He has published 4 monographs, scores of book chapters, and made innumerable contributions to scholarly peer-reviewed journals and indeed to conferences. He is one of UCC's most distinguished scholars and teachers. Is mór ag Nell Buttimer chuid ceangalcha muinterish conacha is taide le Gaeltachtaí na Muin, le Gaeltacht Boscarí, agus le Gaeltacht Corcaigh. I'd like you to give a warm welcome, please, to Nell Buttimer.
I wish that Eugene, Lorraine, Patrick and Niall had written my paper, but unfortunately that's not the case. It's a pleasure to return to this beautiful building where, in 2015, I had the privilege of launching Kilmurry, the war years 1915 to 1918, by the esteemed historian and your near neighbour, Mr. Michael Galvin. Michael is to be congratulated on many other fine works in the interval. We are here today for a different purpose, even if not entirely unrelated to Michael Galvin's own research. In discussing a person like Terence MacSwiney, one concentrates on the man himself, the issues of concern to him, as well as the time during which he lived. The conference is part of an ongoing exploration of such topics, set undoubtedly to carry forward into the coming years and future similar events. In that connection, Terence's involvement with Irish suggested itself to Mr. Niall Murray and colleagues as a relevant theme, possibly overlooked. One speaker, very well placed to address the matter, whom I shall name shortly, was not available to make a presentation on it, regrettably. Niall deserves heartfelt thanks, with no censure, for instead issuing the invitation to me. I do not claim expertise regarding Terence MacSwiney, and certainly not the expertise Niall has demonstrated. Therefore, please correct what the talk will state, if astray on any point, or amplify the discussion as you see fit. It is my intention to outline the general context in which one might place MacSwiney with respect to Irish, examine some specific aspects of evidence available for his interaction with the language and its heritage, and draw conclusions from those data. Although that expose is rather precise in its purposes, we can hopefully adhere, when possible, to the subject of education as the weekend's principal focus. My involvement with the topic would in fact have derived from attempts to appreciate who those persons were to whom we are indebted for establishing public systems, including educational, in which Irish now operates, and understand what their contribution to its shaping may have been. The angle I propose to take on the issue is that of idealism. This word enjoys currency in philosophy, where, I presuppose, it describes debate about whether the world has an external reality or is only as we perceive it to be. You won't hear any enlightenment from me about the minutiae of that question, except to say it does have merit, insofar as it relates to establishing the parameters of Terence's knowledge of any discipline. Idealism, in another sense, is a term one might naturally associate with him. He enjoys justifiable standing as a person who gave his life in the advocacy of his beliefs. That may not exhaust lessons to be learned from his exemplary conduct in other respects, aspects of which his engagement with Irish illustrates. His aspirations for the subject and actions on its behalf left a legacy to the language to be mentioned later. Side by side with those positives, certain constraints must also be noted, however. This brings us back to the topic of perception or awareness. MacSwiney may have formed impressions of Irish tradition that do not necessarily capture the totality of its essence. Given his largely open disposition and a committed, habitual inquiring mind, I'm confident he would not balk at that observation, but remain receptive to the existence of possibilities of which he was not yet fully conscious. Let's get to the nub of the matter straight away, rather than that lofty, abstract speculation. Gaelic Ireland experienced two major trends in MacSwiney's lifetime. One was continuing endangerment due to famine mortality and post-famine immigration. The second was sustained effort in the last quarter of the 19th century to reverse that pattern and enhance the language's position. Conradh na Gaeilge, or the Gaelic League, is the entity we associate most readily with that movement. This body was established in Cork by 1894, 1 year after being founded in Dublin. Its development here was described by Treilc Óréir Dáin in a book, Conradh na Gaeilge Agorcaig, published during 2000, based on his UCC doctoral thesis, which I supervised, fortunately or otherwise. The publication and dissertation both deal with the League as organisation, its branch network, local, county, provincial, and to an extent national committee structures, creation of a cadre of travelling teachers and representatives. Added chapters consider teaching, cultural competitions, the preservation of manuscript and oral matter, the fostering of a modern literature, essays, poetry, plays, and the like. Treilc drew on sources like newspapers, the Cork Constitution, Cork Examiner, Cork Weekly Examiner, I think a publication called the Cork Sun, and their equivalents, to create his thoroughgoing narrative. MacSwiney, as you realise, interacted with the League, a fact noted in standard biographies such as those by Maureen Chavas, 1961, Diarmuid O'Brien, 1979, or Francis J. Costello, 95, and possibly others. These foundational works, for ready access to which I thank my UCC colleague Sean O'Lee, are helpful points of departure for this and other dimensions to his career. Their coverage of his interaction with Conradh na Gaeilge is, however, perfunctory and predates issuance of Óréir Dáin's work. A prerequisite in studying him, therefore, will be the need to revisit sources Treilc Óréir Dáin consulted to search out their references to MacSwiney. These, in turn, might modify or enlarge on Óréir Dáin's account. Treilc Óréir Dáin tells me those notices of MacSwiney do exist in abundance in the records which were available to him. He confirmed that much in a telephone call to me on Thursday last. The call came from the University of Montana, Missoula, where Óréir Dáin directs the institution's Irish Studies programme. He would have been the first choice speaker for today, but is detained by work commitments. Terry might have been obvious also for no other reason than having been named after Treilc MacSwiney, with whom his grandfather participated in the drive for independence, and Treilc said to me on Thursday last that Treilc MacSwiney won the War of Independence. While awaiting that broadly based trawl and sifting, I shall have to make do with more discrete sources. Discrete, I mean specific. The first such is held in my own workplace under the care of this afternoon's distinguished chairman. Components of it help tell the necessary tale of Terence's command of Irish. UCC doesn't possess a major collection of MacSwiney material, but retains some intriguing items in that connection, that is, the language. One is a document purchased from Mealy's auctioneers in 2004, as confirmed to me by Mr. John Rooney of Boole Library's Special Collections, to whom I'm indebted for assistance in consulting it. The library catalogue describes it simply as Lá Scríobhán Gaeilge. The piece carries the date 1917. It comes thus from the latter phase of Terence's life and reveals accordingly a certain amount of what he knew about the vernacular at that stage. The work is a short 12-page copybook in his hand. It is entirely in Irish. The text comprises over 40 individual, generally paragraph-length entries, numbered relatively consistently and correctly. Different forms of language practice are comprised in them. These extend from basic usage, like questions or dialogue, to aphoristic expressions, to snatches of verse, possibly song. A few examples should give a flavour of what's going on. The two opening lines are Ceiste go mort, a question for you in my translation, everybody understands it, agus cá bhfuil tú ag hasamh, where are you standing? To overcome the tedium of such rudimentary queries, a degree of humour follows. Ceiste go mort, an mó edible bow the rithach on air go dtí an talamh. How many cows' tails would it take to extend from the air to the ground? That's an inquiry about amount or distance and how to ask the same. Answer: Éan edible amháin dámbeadh sé fada góla. One tail if it were long enough. That kind then gives way to idioms such as trí ní ná féidir abhainn, go filíocht agus féidir. Three things that cannot be learned: voice, verse, and generosity. Or trí ní ná féidir iscint, foiir, goé agus grá. An edge, wind, and love. The final entry from this brief sampling is rather intriguing. I cannot tell whether it is the remnant of a poem or shows some echo of a riddle or other format. But this is it. The bhí ban whistle roias in chuineh sa bhór. The bhí lasa na róise na leachan. The líos lé stróidech, chun gur chahas ma foslé, agus is I bróiste chloró víos maidin. I translate. There was a very fine noble lady against me, or coming towards me in the road. The sheen of the rose was in her cheek. I began strolling with her until I lost my posting with her, or on account of her, and in Cloró parish was I by morning. The passage almost has metrical form, as you'll have heard from its somewhat incomplete but embryonic accentual vowel pattern. What interests me here is not that solely, but also the mention of Cloró, if such is intended. There is a pointer to an association there between this particular location in rural County Cork and the Gaelic love song Inheritance, if that is what the piece of the poem is about. It reminds one of Terence's sister Ehin's, or Annie's, later recollection in the preface to the anthology collection of her late brother's verse entitled Despite Fool's Gold, published in 1994. Of earlier times, the family spent immersed in an even more traditional environment farther west, and this is what she said. Back then to the turf fire and touring dove, to the tales of the hills and their mysteries, of the dead coach that crossed Lochabawn in the moonlight, of the fairy folk and the spirits that brooked no trespasser from dusk to dawn. The somewhat indeterminate condition of the Cloró text and other issues with spelling accuracy in the UCC Codex suggests that even by the late 1910s, Terence remained a student of Irish. There is alternative confirmation of his learner status up to that point. This occurs in the magnificent set of papers his relatives entrusted to Cork Public Museum in the middle of the last century after that facility opened in the elegant Fitzgerald's Park residence of the Beamish family. I'm obliged to Mr. Daniel Breen, curator, Dan Breen, and Miss Polly Van Frampton for enabling me to access the collection currently in over 20 metal file boxes. From among these, I highlight 4 blue-covered, hardbound scrapbooks dating from 1908 to 1913, a stretch of 6 years. What all comprise are cuttings from the aforementioned Cork Weekly Examiner. We might look nowadays on the latter as a form of digest or supplement of news summaries, often consisting of Gaelic League reports, circulating in this area but equally destined for the expatriate Cork and Irish readership. In this instance, excerpts relate exclusively to the writings of Anthair Padro Laire, 1832 to 1920. He's regarded as the pioneer of contemporary Irish language prose, as rendered in the famous Caint na Líne, people's speech, rather than modes of expression rooted in previous centuries. O'Leary, from near Carriganimmen, studied at Maynooth and ministered in various Cloyne diocese parishes. He is best known for a novel-like version of the Faust legend called Siena, the story of a man who sells his soul to the devil and regrets the decision, finally reverses it. Terence MacSwiney's scrapbooks are taken up with complete copies of no fewer than 5 of O'Leary's other works, being modern Irish retellings of older sagas such as Ca Rishnari, the fate of King Conchobar following the epic poem Ó Cúailnge, the tale of Guaidh the Generous, a 6th century Connaught ruler, and Anthair Padr's lengthy summary of the Bible. After their serialization, each was published as an independent text between 1913 and 1922. MacSwiney, however, first gathered them as they came out. His meticulousness is seen in the systematic, sequential dating of each newspaper cutting among hundreds he pasted into those record books. There aren't many, if indeed any, other markings on the text of each. Nonetheless, I cannot envisage that he did not use them. In confirmation of same, Terence subsequently owned a copy of O'Leary's later separate printed version in modern Irish of the 4 Gospels. It was advertised as an item he consulted daily during his last days in Brixton, when that Gospel text was auctioned some time back, realising thousands of euro at sale. I think it was in Mealy's as well. I couldn't relocate it when I went back looking for it in Google, but it's there. The presentation so far has dwelt on MacSwiney as learner or reader of Irish. He also wrote in the language. Evidence for this is found in documentation now at Cork City and County Archives. I acknowledge Mr. Stephen Skeldon and Mr. Brian McGee of that centre in connection with accessing items in their care. Pieces from the astonishingly rich donation by Father Dominic, chaplain to Trail of MacSwiney, can be selected. Some impression of the extent of that resource may be gained from the fact that a fine inventory of its contents, completed by Deirdre Heafy in 1995, runs itself to 60 printed pages. Among over 350 individual documents, various items of correspondence in Irish items of correspondence in Irish dating to 1920, the last year of MacSwiney's life, during which, as has been stated, he was simultaneously a member of the recently established Dáil and Lord Mayor of Cork after the killing on March 20th of Tomás MacCurtain, 1884 to 1920. An interesting thing about MacCurtain was his birth date and death date are the same, 20th of March. And believe it or not, there are statisticians in UCD who have worked on the probability of being let's say, born and dying on the same day of the week. But whether they have considered that possibility, I do not know. Terence's Gaelic letters reflect in the first instance the raising of monies in connection with the first Dáil loan, the internal component of it based in Ireland proper as opposed to the external outside the country. Though issuing receipts, adabálacha, and the like. Procedures further comprised reporting to Michael Collins, 1890 to 1922, TD for Cork South and subsequently Minister for Finance, under whose overall control the scheme operated. Dispatches between Michael and Terence were completed entirely as Gaeilge. Topics raised included whether to accept monies proffered by supporters of the fund in notes or otherwise, particularly gold, the relative merits or drawbacks of either, such as optimal times or prices at which to acquire the precious metal. In mid-summer 1920, Collins was keeping a watchful eye on returns for various districts against targets set. Expressing anger at poor subventions from certain regions, Michael Collins stated, in characteristically colourful terms, if things did not improve, Gorabé is Stohi Gumeng Eglorad Fulla. It's most likely I'll be looking for blood. The blood of that great figure in Irish history would itself, of course, be spilled on a roadside south of Kilmurry a little over 2 years afterwards on Tuesday, the 22nd of August 1922. It would be incorrect of me to convey the idea that MacSwiney's written Irish was the finished article in exchanges of this kind. Terence went on to suggest to Micheál O'Culloy what other sources could conceivably be tapped to boost the loan fund apart from donations. In so doing, he used English terms only for licenses and income tax in correspondence to the Minister for Finance, otherwise fully, as I say, Osqueig. The rather experimental nature of Irish, probably MacSwiney's, in matters of statecraft may be seen further in a different document. This is the statement issued by Cork Corporation following Thomas McCurthoy's assassination. The English version noted, and I quote, "The verdict of wilful murder brought against the Royal Irish Constabulary, the executive of the British government, requesting all governments of the civilised world to take diplomatic action compelling Britain to evacuate our country. It claimed that if a Lord Mayor of the city can be murdered with impunity, the foundation of the governments of all nations will be imperiled." A considerable portion of this statement's Irish copy poses no problem, such as "Dair vre devar dumunvarahe," expressing the guilty verdict. Asking for a diplomatic response, however, is rendered "Dereir adir hir hochta." Adir hir hochta. That, I suspect, is a once-off formation with no prior attestation in the language and possibly limited to non-existence currency thereafter. Michael Collins was able to provide MacSwiney with words for licence and income tax, etc. in Irish in his replies. That came, one imagines, from operating in a parliamentary environment, albeit besieged, which had in its secretariat, from day one, a language service still in existence, run over Astrachain. Its function was to provide for the conduct of all Dáil business in Irish, enabling debate, the drafting of multilingual bills, acts, statutory instruments, and all other paraphernalia of governance. From it would evolve dictionaries, terminological databases, and standards extending far beyond the houses of the Oireachtas in their reach to encompass education, the media, and other outlets. The same background led to Irish becoming an official working language of the European Union, further enhancing its international as well as national position. On a broader note again, Derry-born linguist Jim McCluskey, currently teaching in the University of California system, argues that the minority language of a speech community comprising 100,000 people or so, which enjoys the support of a state apparatus, has placed itself at the desired threshold for survival. Official letter writing and usage by the likes of Terence MacSwiney must be recognised ultimately for having brought about that advantageous situation. Although MacSwiney employed Irish for functional purposes, there would appear to be limits to his creative mastery of it. From what I have seen of his corpus of writings to date, no large original work in that medium is forthcoming. He differs in that regard from the likes of Thomas MacCurtain, who has a certain body of Gaelic verse among his papers. Terence admitted to a restricted competency already as far back as 1907 in this claim: "I am stripped of the power that should be mine of clothing my thought, however poor, in that language which I could be proud of as my country's and my own." The sentence is taken from the preface to his The Music of Freedom, published in Cork by his The Risen Gael Press. That work of over 100 printed pages comprises a virtually continuous poem, where the natural world cries out at the unseemly suppressed state of Ireland. The land's torments are evoked together with steps necessary to take towards restoring a harmonious, proper order. I'm reluctant to comment too much on it because not an expert on English poetry of this or any other period. You will already have heard last year on that matter from my UCC colleague Dr. Maire Breen in a lecture about MacSwiney's versification, which I read about in the programme last year, I think. Am I right in that? It is possibly in The Music of Freedom that the well-known Cork historian Patrick Maughan detects influences from the radical English lyricist Percy Bysshe Shelley, 1792 to 1822, although to my thinking the MacSwiney text appears to have echoes from a fellow Englishman, William Blake, 1757 to 1827, and his cataclysmic prophetic outlook. Whatever of those matters, I see no traces in Music of Freedom of references to Gaelic tradition. Irish language literature has a lengthy heritage of millenarian visionary verse, as embodied in the genre known as the Ashling, for example. That, in essence, sees Ireland personified as a woman speak to the poet about the island's dishevelled condition, but with the prospect of deliverance through the agency of a gifted supporter. Could it be that MacSwiney then felt himself insufficiently familiar with poetry of that type, resulting in what looks like failure to adopt its diction and imagery in The Music of Freedom? This is not to impugn the calibre of that work per se. It did attract admirers. UCC Library's copy was a gift to the institution in 1928 by its well-known alumnus, short story writer, historian, literateur and erstwhile Gaelgeower Sean O'Foyle, 1900 to 1991, who signed the bookplate. In Music of Freedom, Terence is involved with a discourse on transformation and its accompanying rhetoric. He does turn to Gaelic literature at times for exemplars of phases or agents in that process and their circumstances throughout his own English language writings. You will probably be aware of this from another strand of MacSwiney's creative output, namely stagecraft. He is the author of some half-dozen plays in the opening decades of the 1900s, in and around 1910 and so forth. I understand these are now the subject of ongoing doctoral research. My comments on them will be confined accordingly to a cursory overview, particularly as the time is going by. I mention two with specifically Irish connections. The manuscript drafts of both are in Cork Public Museum. Additional typescript evidence relating to each is forthcoming in UCD archives, a collection also generously donated by Terence's relatives, to be regarded as the fourth major repository of MacSwiney data, apart from institutions named earlier, with the National Library of Ireland being the fifth. Cork Public Museum holds 3 handwritten recensions of the 3-act drama Last Warriors of Cool. So far as I can tell, one of its core themes is heroic leadership, the development and exploitation of resilience necessary to guide both oneself and others in reaction against mortal, fateful odds, a guidance exemplified by the celebrated character Nell McCoole of Fianna fame. Various aspects of heroic conduct would resurface in another 3-act MacSwiney play, The Wooing of Emer. This drama relays the courtship by the celebrated Cuchulainn of Ulster of his future spouse. Should you wish to find out what that lady is thought to have looked like, by the way, please book into the Slieve Russell Hotel Cavan on a midweek over 50s offer, where you can see a metal statue of her at the foot of the stairs, in a slightly more relaxed pose than her prospective husband in Oisin Kelly's GPO depiction. I quote the 2 opening lines from the first of Cork Public Museum's 3 manuscript recensions. And on that, an article in yesterday's copy of the Guardian newspaper restates the importance of what appears at the very start of literary works as key to revealing all that follows. In The Wooing of Emer, the initial speaker is neither of the principals, but Cuchulainn's charioteer Niall, who asks, "Where is the glory of Craobh Rua now?" A warrior wrapped in a woman's dream. The Craobh Rua reference, Red Branch, is to the Ulster community generally, and the residents at its capital, Owen, now Navan, Fort County Armagh, which symbolises that society. As I see matters, The Wooing of Emer presents a central dichotomy between personal or private emotional interest on the one hand, and serving the public good on the other, on the part of a hero charged with that task. It requires considerable effort of the imagination to create, as MacSwiney did in his verse and plays, platforms for the examination of critically important topics. These include, as we have seen, national restoration, fortitude, and a call to duty, in the order in which we discussed thematics among the last 3 compositions. Authors turn consistently to the past when reflecting on those or other issues. James Joyce, 1882-1941, writing around the same time, would have employed a similar strategy when taking Ulysses or Odysseus as model for Leopold Bloom's survival in a situation of not inconsiderable adversity or challenge as this Jewish character traversed turn-of-the-century Dublin. Reinterpretation, however, does not exhaust the possibility of other meaning in the sources, neither for Joyce nor MacSwiney. How they presented earlier works does not confer absolute validity on their presentations. Take the case of the Fianna, whose archetypal ruler Fianna McCoole features in The Last Warriors of Cool. The position of Fianna in early Irish life is more complex than that of heroic defence. Fianna groups in the past are generally comprised of male youths in transition to adulthood, with as yet no fixed place in society. Their youthful status reveals them to be full of promise, but equally still not established. Managing the transition may or may not be successful. If remaining socially isolated, negative outcomes can lead to tensions with the establishment and within Fiann groups proper. MacSwiney might not necessarily always have conveyed that earlier reality when defining Fianna Fáil as the name of the ancient soldiers of Ireland, of Fionn and his Fiann, the armed patriots who held Ireland against the might of Rome. Would you believe it? That is a citation of his in the short-lived periodical Fianna Fáil he established in Cork on 19 September 1914 with a journal for militant Ireland as its subtitle, and which was discussed by Niall a short while back. Fianna Fáil is, of course, the name adopted by one political grouping in Ireland after independence. Its founder, Eamon de Valera's signature is on UCC's copy of Terence MacSwiney's posthumously published Principles of Freedom, 1921, just one token of the latter's influence on the former. Principles contains its author's reflections on issues pertinent to securing the titles of objectives, which is freedom, participants in the exercise, and to some extent the character of the end destination. It has entries on the role of women, which I do not propose to dissect here, except to note the same issue crops up in the Wooing of Emer drama, spoken of a short while ago. That drama appears as a male-centred perspective on social function. Its early Irish Ulster cycle forerunners present alternative points of view. Among these are sagas like Ninden Othard, discussing the cost to females of uninvited and unwitting involvement in the public realm, or in a text called Adil Derv Orgwed, equally costly and fatal rivalry between females in the same public sphere. At issue here are questions like liberty versus convention or conformity, which, much though MacSwiney may have taken umbrage at his portrayal of Irish life, John Millington Synge, 1871 to 1909, captured to considerable effect in his last item for the stage, Deirdre of the Sorrows. What I'm trying to say is early Irish society is more complex maybe than MacSwiney allows you to understand. These present reflections of mine relate to the nature and adequacy of Terence MacSwiney's employment of Gaelic literature in his own original writings. He does offer a personal take on them, but as I say, there are alternative interpretations. These have come about in no small measure as a result of initiatives Terence and his contemporaries ultimately set in train. MacSwiney's normal lifespan, I believe, should have seen him survive into the 1950s possibly. By that stage, the School of Celtic Studies and the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, which Eamon de Valera founded in the 1940s, was up and running. It produced path-breaking editions of early texts with accompanying commentary which broadened and deepened our appreciation of the Irish past. The Institute complemented and extended the activities of the Irish Manuscripts Commission of the late 1920s, not to mention the labours of the Irish Folklore Commission in the following decade. Considerable expansion in the Irish university sector dating from the 1960s to the present has enlarged out of all recognition the capacity and scope for further analysis. In acknowledging this progress, it's also necessary to admit some concerns. Little of the material now becoming so abundantly available is presented to participants in Irish education at formative levels. The secondary school's Irish language curricula currently contain limited to non-existent components on Irish literature extending over a millennium, the likes of what MacSwiney drew, and which he would undoubtedly have regarded as essential for a complete understanding of Irish experience, because that is what he was about. The situation is all the more urgent because of the precarious position of history and syllabi in that sector, history being the other obvious domain equipped to approach the same task. Principles of freedom envisage the emergence of structures functioning in Terence's own day, which will secure the fostering of identity and selfhood in this country. He looked forward to their endurance not solely in the short term, but during decades, and as he specifies, centuries to come. If alive today, one can imagine robust exchanges about perceptible shortcomings in key educational sectors regarding what is provided to current and prospective citizens. All that being said, my purpose was to speak about Terence's interaction with Irish, primarily, and in an admittedly preliminary fashion. I submit it's a significant component of his history in need of further study. He devoted considerable time to the subject. Evidence associated with it adds basic factual detail to the picture one might paint of his activities and undertakings. So do the data as regards profiling his intellectual development, attainments, but also the boundaries of same. The testimony may be of relevance not alone for Trail of MacSwiney, but others of his counterparts as well. It is likely there is greater awareness of contributions made by Owen MacNeill, Douglas Hyde and Patrick Pearse in the realm of Irish as a result of their theoretical reflections on the issue coupled with their practical input. Terence might not have been as programmatic as they were in exactly the same sense. He joins in that regard a cohort including the likes of McCurtain, Collins and even De Valera. What the latter share with him is that their involvement with the language equally awaits exhaustive treatment. Not all that easy because of the widely dispersed nature of the sources. Should the subject receive that comprehensive coverage, I suggest it will add a layer of colouring to illustrating a period regarding which we still have only the basic outlines. Trusting this afternoon's talk will not have discouraged anybody from travelling down that particular route in their research.
Absolutely superb papers this afternoon. And what is so striking is how original, how we are benefiting from original research here. Great minds being applied to the primary sources, and here we are reaping the immediate benefits of those. So I'd like to offer an opportunity for anybody to ask any questions, and we have both Neil and Niall here to answer them, maybe for around 5 or 6 minutes.
Both very, very good reflective studies, and I would like to make a few reflections on a few things that I may have or we may have as a family, which might add to a little bit of the interpretation. As regards Muriel and Terence, she encouraged him more towards Irish. It's more the other way around. And as regards the interaction with Michael Collins himself admitted that he hadn't learned Irish that well when he was in London, and he was working on it, and there was an effort that he was trying to make. As regards the thing about seeking blood, The issue was that what was collected in this area, mid Cork, was by far the greatest in the whole of Ireland, and not so in Cork City. And the issue was, Collins was blaming whoever's in charge of Cork City, who will remain nameless, as against Terence MacSwiney, and saying, would you go in and start to do Cork City? So that was the issue. As regards to the issue about the Irish language and where he was in terms of the Irish language, first of all, if he was to see himself as having a career in any way at all, other than the things that, in other words, as he said to, I think, Donald Cortra, it'll be all very well for you after these years, you'll be a writer, and I won't be here. But if he was to be a writer. And that was his wish, and that would, in other words, he saw himself primarily as a dramatist and as a writer, as an author, and that was what he would have liked to do. Now, obviously, he was growing from the Ibsen tradition and the Shakespeare tradition and the English poets and so on, but that was the tradition that he had access to and that he was growing out of. But when you look at what he was doing, and of the material that we've given as a family, and there's some material left which we have, which is, I would have to go into negotiation with our archivist who's beside me here, Catherine, who's responsible for History's Daughter, but we do have, it could throw light on some things. First of all, we have his notes for his degree in mental and moral science, handwritten notes, but we also have some, when he established the magazine Fianna Fáil, and he brought out the issues, the British didn't prescribe it until he had committed so much money to it, and he had so much borrowed, that what he had to do is he had to sell his vast library. He was only interested in books. That's where all the money went. He sold them all, except a few things. And we have those few things. And they're books in which they're annotations in Irish, or about learning Irish words. For instance, 2 copies of The Imitation of Christ, Athair Christ, where he's actually making handwritten notes in pencil about the meanings of words. I believe that, and there is an interesting discussion that took place, an argument that took place in the 30s between Donald Corcra and Monsignor Paddy Brown about the hidden Ireland and what way to develop Irish culture. And Donald Corcra is saying you must go into the hidden Ireland and you'll find it all there. And Paddy Brown was saying, no, you have to go out foreign. And once you get an appreciation of things internationally, you realise the severance that you have at home. So I think that this discussion was taking place earlier, and I think that Terence MacSwiney really was seeing both the Christian legacy, as in the Athair Christ, the Imitation of Christ, and also the legacy from the Irish culture, as things that he wanted a shaping from both. And I think he spent a lot more time on that than people realised, because maybe he was so much more confident in the English language. So I would say he had a commonality with my other grandfather, who was also a city boy who learned Irish and ended up speaking Irish in the home. Both of them did, though living in cities. But both proposed and seconded together 2 motions. One about the Ode to the Dáil, but the other one is that there should be a Ministry of the Irish Culture. And I believe that this was embedded in his view. I think when you see the annotations, you realise that he was developing confidence in the Irish language, but actually had quite a lot of confidence in it. Then the little books that he gave, for instance, the book that he gave Muriel, it was on our Shinshire. They were learning songs. They were really embedding themselves quite deeply. And I think that he was much further along the road in that direction. And I think it is worthy of a study, and I thank you both for raising this issue so well today. Good morning.
Thank you very much.
The most helpful thing to have is a good guide to sources. The guide which exists for Cork City and County Archives is professional, clear, understandable. I was speaking to Dan Breen, and I think there are events in train or prospect for next year. When I went to the public museum in Fitzgerald's Park, a similar guide did not exist. Therefore, oneself has to sit down and go through the material, and would you believe it, the same holds for UCD, where they're very good at archiving and inventorying collections, but there is no detailed inventory of what your family has deposited in UCD. Therefore, a very simple first step would have to be a complete listing of all material relating to Terence MacSwiney. I don't mean the newspapers, which is a mammoth task, and it took Trailock about 8 or 9 more years to write his doctorate. His mother was absolutely tearing her hair out. But with specific or discrete collections such as the ones in your possession and the 4 or 5 others, it should be possible to get the basics of the Terence archive down right.
Yeah, however, we would be prepared to give the material to an appropriate place. And there's a point I did miss. He spent his weekends going to the west of the city to take down the life story of a Fenian called O'Murrachu, and he published it as Scale Shandon.
That's right, yeah.
And I think that there's a lot in there in his...
Well, when I went down to the Cork Public Museum, I nearly fell off the chair when I saw the richness of what is down there. Niall put a book up there, I think, or put citations from, excerpts from Principles of Freedom, which was published, as he pointed out, in Irish Freedom, and then later portions of it in Fianna Fáil paper. Terence's working copy to draft that publication is in Cork Public Museum. And similar to his cutting excerpts out of the Cork Weekly News for Brugha and the other stuff, he has laid them out there in a pre-publication order, and there is an MA for sure in that. There are any number of postdoctoral or doctoral studies. So what I would say is that people are going to plan for next year, e.g. commemorative events, which are very welcome, but the best thing is to have a really good legacy, such as proper, authoritative, painstaking descriptions of the primary sources, and I think that would fit very well Trailock's character, because he was a meticulous man. And let that be a jumping off point there now, I'd say, for next year.
If it helps on that point, I've had opportunity to meet with some people at the local authority level in Cork, and earlier this year when they were inviting ideas for the commemoration period in 1920, and that coincidentally Neil says it here, and as you've mentioned there, but I did encourage that the full cataloguing of the McCartan and the MacSwiney papers in Cork Public Museum would do a great service for increasing awareness of both and extending their legacies and understanding of it.
If I may just add a little more.
One addition, and then we have a question down at the back.
The MacSwiney and Brugha families deserve enormous credit for providing public access through universities and the Cork Public Museum. I don't think there are many examples of that level of generosity.
There aren't.
No. And I think you deserve a round of applause.
I've met some people here already. Fiona Brennan is my name. Just a couple of things to say as regards the catalogue and the non-existence of a catalogue in Cork Public Museum. I suppose I'm killing 2 birds with one stone. I'm delighted to be working with Cork City Library and with permission from the MacSwiney family, working on the collected plays of Terence for next year. And I'm also, fingers crossed, I've been talking with Dan Green, the curator of the Cork Public Museum, and it's my plan to try and put that catalogue listing together. Super.
And there'll be a copy for everybody in the
Obviously no name in the City Library. So I suppose it's killing 2 birds with one stone, and that I've gone back doing some work on archival studies anyway. But I just want to say I started off, I'm at a very, very early stage of doing the work on the collected plays. It's an absolutely fascinating archive to be working in. And I suppose the way I've done work on, I did my PhD on a Kerry playwright called George Fitzmaurice, another forgotten playwright. But I think we're talking about lifelong learning and we're talking about education over this weekend. Terence, I suppose the first thing I wanted to do was try to get to know the man, you know, and you really, really, he's a type of individual that you just fall for and that you wish you had known. That was my first feeling about him. But he was so humble when he was talking about his work as a dramatist. And if you're looking at, he was only writing drama for a handful of years. But he was quite open to saying, I'm only learning the craft. I am learning. But I think what's forgotten is what he contributed to what came afterwards, the 1920s, 30s, particularly if you're looking at Cork City Theatre, another history that's completely overlooked, 3 centuries of it, which is an absolute crying shame. But he was working with the likes of Lennox Robinson, who later became artistic director in the Abbey Theatre, most of you will know. But Robinson had connections with the Cork Dramatic Society, so he had connections with MacSwiney, and naturally they were all learning from each other. But in the 20s, what starts to happen in Cork is, again, I suppose they're reflecting what's happening in Dublin with the Dublin Drama League, and they're trying to introduce international theatre to Dublin, to Cork. So I think, you know, if the man had lived, the contribution that he would have made to theatre, not just in Cork, not just nationally, but I think internationally, if I'm not going too far, would have been absolutely superb, because it's his, I suppose, his absolute love of culture, theatre, writing, and without a shadow of a doubt, Cathal, we were talking about this before, he would have been a writer, and there's, I suppose, evidence that I found, I want to be revealed, what his plans were around his theatre career, you know, if he could learn the craft well enough. So all I can say is that I'm going to do my best as regards the Cathal and Cork City Museum, but I would certainly encourage people, it's, as Steve said, it's absolute wealth. It's just an incredible, incredible archive, as well as the new CD. And just echo again what the family have done for allowing us availability of that archive is superb. Thank you. Sorry to take it so much.
Is there another question? No. Aidan has asked me to say a few words of conclusion, but maybe first I'd like to thank both Neil and Niall and ask you to do so for their extraordinary papers, and also for the wonders that we've just unearthed, which I think you know, bode well for the future and possibly for future events like this, both here and elsewhere. So, thank you both. So, out of your misery in that regard, to read a poem that I wrote, which was commissioned by Deirdre in her role as Cathaoirleach, as chairperson of this great association last year. A poem to commemorate Terence MacSwiney, and which I accepted with great honour to do. Unfortunately, I wasn't here this time last year to read it, so it gives me great pleasure to do so now. And it's a poem that I struggled with, because a commission is a request to write something. Normally, creative work comes from the febrile imagination, from the subconscious almost, and comes when you don't always expect it. So one tries to facilitate the muse or the inspiration when it comes. To sit down and approach a topic more rationally is a big challenge, actually, and a big challenge for me. And so when asked to write something about and for Terence MacSwiney, I thought a lot. I tried to localise his presence here, these connections to here. One very small one, by the way, is that if you literally threw a stone from here in that direction, you would hit a point where the priest who wrote made the first translation of Imitatio Christi, the Imitation of Christ, which has been mentioned here a number of times as a great favourite of MacSwiney's, was born. I think Father O'Sullivan, if I'm not mistaken, one-time parish priest of Inishkeen. Donal Sullivan, yeah. So a lot of connections with the man, but where I went was out to Kilmurry. In Kilmurry there's a rock, there's an outcrop of rock with some megalithic rock art on the rock. It could date from as far as 4,500 years BC. It could date from maybe 1500 years BC, but it contains rock art, which is quite extraordinary. And if you like, it is the rock art, megalithic rock art is abstract. We don't really know what the curly cues and the pock marks and the scratches and the chevrons and the patterns all mean. But it's possibly the oldest mark of man and woman in the parish, and it's probably the oldest item of abstract art, one of the oldest in Ireland. And so I went out to the stone in Kilmurry, the Kilmurry stone as the archaeologists call it, and I thought about Terence MacSwiney. And on the 16th of August in 1920, when Terence MacSwiney was accosted in the streets of Cork, he was arrested for treason because in his pocket he had a cipher. He had a piece of paper which could decode RIC messages. And that was the pretext on which he was nabbed, on which he was taken. And of course he was sent sometime later to Brixton, and we know what his fate was. But the cipher began to resonate with me. And of course the rock is a cipher. We don't know what the rock means. The rock is a kind of a code which must have meant something to somebody in the same way as MacSwiney had in his pocket a set of instructions which decoded similar ciphers. So I wrote a poem called Cipher, which doesn't rhyme and which didn't really come to any particular conclusion. When I write poems, I like them to have some kind of resolution, not necessarily logical conclusion, but some kind of Aristotelian beginning, middle and end. This one didn't, and it was because I suppose I was very troubled and still am by that immense act of self-sacrifice that MacSwiney did, that decision to starve his body and end his life for the convictions that he held and for the beliefs that he held, which had nothing whatsoever to do with any valorization of the ego, but had everything to do with trying to deliver the kind of country and the kind of place that we now enjoy here. So that kind of self-sacrifice and the paradox of that kind of act of self-harm was something that I tried to grapple with. I'll read it, put you out of your misery. It's called Cipher, and it's in memoriam Terence MacSwiney. And it describes my confrontation and time out with the rock. At first sight, a brow, head recumbent, face staring at the clouds. Gaining, a stooped figure, head bowed, arms embracing something broad. On closer approach, 2 stones, no, only one, a model plateau and mountain range. Flapping whiskey label, trampled sandwich packaging. The cup marks like corries, the whole massif almost oval, waist high, a step on the western side, broad sloping flank to the north. Shear marks, crevices, a long natural gash. On the southern side, moss, lichen, stonewort in the holes. Soiled water lodged in a sunken cirque. Calcified bird droppings, quartzite white. A battered opaque yogurt container. The surrounding field, thick grass, free of weed, inclining up to Clearach. Trees deckling the ridge. A dog barks. I keep the familiar horizon behind me, read the creases and hollows with smooth, clean hands, circles, grooves, gutters, diagonals, a raised rib cage. I am a drone over a stone land. I step back to take a photograph, the flat western face like an aged cetacean, the blown grass silvering mystically as the clouds part to release a raven into the throat of the valley. Map? Memorial? Message? And was it worth it? Pastoral peace as far as the eye can see, relative sustainability, the island divided but not ungovernable when we put our minds to it, some residual sense of the Gaelic, independent still, despite tyrannies of prayer, power, progress. Your bravery didn't save the day, or the world, or you, but you knew the power of empire and fear, and that your courage would make us think about pride, resilience, peace. Everything you forfeited in that cell so that we could figure it out for ourselves, read the signs, get the message, even if it still makes no sense. Thank you. And thanks again to Deirdre for the opportunity to write that, and then now to Aidan for the opportunity to read it. And on behalf of I suppose, everybody here, I want to thank Aidan as the chair for putting together and leading and masterminding with so many others such an extraordinarily successful weekend. I want to thank Aidan and the entire committee. I'm not going to name them all, but in naming Aidan, I'm naming you, so thank you. And not only the committee, but the volunteers as well, who have been so extraordinary in making this venue work in so many contexts and for so many people, not just here and during the weekend. I want to thank the speakers. It has been a huge privilege to have Cathal here. It is though we are in contact with the source in some way, and that we have both validation of your presence and also the insights and experiences, first-hand some of them. So we're extremely honoured, and I think we've benefited hugely, and I hope we will continue to do so as a historic community. Thank you, Cathal. Also, obviously, Aidan. I want to thank Anne, the other speakers, Sinéad. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here this morning, but Anne and Sinéad for your papers, and Niall, and also Neil for theirs. In advance, I suppose I want to thank Padre Reda for Mass tomorrow morning and for what he's going to do. I don't know, Aidan, you might want to say a little bit about that in a moment. But it's going to happen. It's not so we're not so much at the end here. And also, one normally thanks the priest for the loan of the hall, but this time we're thanking the Monsignor for the use of the church. So Monsignor O'Callaghan was extremely generous in allowing us into the church last night for a wonderful ceremony. They say that all politics is local, and that's true to some extent. I wonder, could you also say that all history is local? Probably stretching it a little bit if we try to say that all history is local, but certainly all history can be viewed from a local perspective, and that's what we've done. And what we do here, generally as an association, I think what we all do, we localise the great events that are happening, and we've been doing that today. What's been striking to me, certainly, is to learn how influential those idealists among us, men and women, who lived at the time we have been studying over the last 2 days, how, again, without much regard for themselves or their interests, how inspirational they were, and how brave and in the best sense idealistic they were for us in establishing the kind of political foundation that we now have. It is, the irony, I imagine, is not lost on any of you that today in the House of Commons, in this archipelago, there are decisions being made which will profoundly affect both the identity and possibly the politics, the conduct of politics on this island. And I suppose there is a strong sense also that the kind of work that our speakers are doing and that the committee is doing here and that you're doing by being interested in history at a local level will hopefully feed into establishing and creating a more sensible political system, let's say, than we possibly have at the moment globally. I'm not criticising any one or any party, but those who establish the political system seem to me to be a great deal more inspirational than many of those who are currently practicing it. But I think that what we do here in studying history must and will and should inform the practice of politics and the conduct of public affairs and public life right now. So don't give up your interest in history, because it is making and will make a difference in the course of events both now and in the future. So it remains for me to say thank you all for participating, thank you for organising, thank you for coming, and thank you for filming. And we hope that you will continue to enjoy the festival, as it were, the weekend, through Mass tomorrow morning, which is at 10 a.m. We will have Padroria, which is hymn composed especially for the occasion. And then there's the walking tour with Niall Murray at 2 p.m. Yes, at 11:30, isn't it?
Yes.
To 2 p.m. Niall. This is the walking tour of Macroom. So, Gurmil Mahgoev Gulair, and thank you to everyone.
Sorry now, folks. Just to add there, folks, just to the closure, which were very well made by John Fitzgerald. We will be meeting outside the Dunn's car park, just for those of you who want to join us on the walking tour. It'll be outside the Dunn's car park at 11:30 tomorrow. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.